Hello everyone, this is Rebecca from Simple Suburban Living, and today we're going to make and then dehydrate refried beans. I'm starting with about 4.5 cups of dried pinto beans, and normally I would just use 2 of the 1-pound packages, but I had basically about 5.5 cups of beans left in a bag of beans, so I figured I would use them all. I've had them soaking for about 12 hours, and so now I'm going to cook them and then I'm going to dehydrate them. And so I'm going to take you through that whole process. So I have the beans in a pot. Normally I cook my beans in an Instant Pot, but I know not all of you have an Instant Pot, so I wanted to just show you it in a regular pot. And I dumped off the water that I had used to soak the beans. I picked out beans that were broken and that type of thing. It looks like I've got a couple of little floaters here, which I can take out as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some seasonings, and I'm going to add just a touch of oil to keep the beans from foaming up so much. And then I will cook them until they're almost done, until they're mostly done, and then I'll add in some salt. And the reason I'm adding salt in later is because salt can keep the beans from softening. It can be harder for them to soften. So I'm going to cook them for about an hour before I add the salt. Now, I didn't measure the water that I put in here, but I put about an inch water, about an inch above the beans. I may need to add more water than that. The reason why I'm starting off with less rather than more is because I don't want to have to drain any of the bean soupy stuff off before I mush them into refried beans. And the reason is because these beans are going to have a lot of flavor. The water is going to have a lot of flavor, and I don't want to lose any of that. So now let's get into adding the items to the beans that are going to make them taste great. Okay, so I have 1 onion that I've diced, really coarsely chopped is more like it. And you can see that my measuring cup here says 1 cup, so it's roughly a cup of diced onion. I'm putting in 1 can of diced green chilies. These are hot. I generally actually prefer to use the less hot, but I had bought these when I was having problems with food shortages and ended up just getting hot. So these might be a little spicier. You can use mild or medium, or no chilies at all if you don't like a lot of spice. I'm going to put in 2 tablespoons of taco seasoning. Roughly a tablespoon of minced garlic, a teaspoon of onion powder, and about a teaspoon of oil. Whoops, I kind of overdid it there a little bit, but that's okay. Now the reason why I'm putting in some but not a lot of oil is that when you're cooking beans, they tend to foam up a lot, and the oil can reduce the amount of foaming that happens. However, I don't want to put too much oil in because since we're going to be dehydrating these, I don't want a lot of fat in the beans. So that was kind of a compromise for me to put in just 1 teaspoon of oil into the beans. So I've got these on medium-high heat. I'm going to bring them up to a boil, and then I'll put the heat down to medium and then put a lid on them and simmer it until they're done. I'll bring you back a couple of times throughout the process so you can see what's happening. Okay, so you can see that they're simmering, and I'm going to turn the heat down a little bit and then just put the lid on, and I'll keep them simmering for probably around an hour. I'll check back and forth. I'll check back on them here and there just to see how they're doing, make sure the water's not boiling down. And then in probably about an hour, once they're tender, I'm going to put some salt in and continue cooking them. Since I'm making refried beans, I'm going to cook them until they're really pretty mushy because it'll just make it easier to blend them up. And Also, I just think that it yields a better flavor. So I'll bring it back when I'm adding the salt in. Beans have been cooking for about an hour now, so I'm just going to test them for doneness. I don't really expect to stop cooking them at this point, but let me just give a little taste. They definitely have a ways to go. I'm going to let them cook for another half hour before I check again. And you can see I still have enough water in there, so I'm going to leave it as is. I am going to go ahead and put in some salt because they've done pretty well so far. I mean, they're mostly done, but I'm going to let them cook quite a bit longer because I want them basically falling apart. So I'm going to put 2 teaspoons of salt. Beans actually require quite a bit of salt in my opinion, and so that may or may not be enough, but you can always add salt. You can't take it away. So I'm going to just leave it at that level, and I'm going to continue simmering for about a half an hour, and then I'll come back and see how they're doing. See you in a bit. Okay, the beans have been cooking for about an hour and a half now, and I don't know if you can tell, but they are breaking up some, but I have tasted some, and some there's still a little bit more bite to them than I like, particularly for when I am going to be making refried beans out of them. I want them basically falling apart. So I'm going to let them go a little bit longer, another half hour at least, until basically they're disintegrating. Also, I tasted for salt, and I am putting a 1/3 teaspoon of salt in. And I'm also going to add in a little bit more garlic. So this is just a matter of taste, and you may not want that much garlic, but we like garlic, and so I'm doing it to our taste. I'm adding in about a tablespoon of garlic, an additional. Remember, I put a tablespoon before, and if I was going to dehydrate these right now, I probably wouldn't put that in because I like to give it a chance to cook into the beans. But since I'm going to cook them for at least another half hour, I know that the garlic will cook into the beans well. So again, that's just a matter of taste. And that's the thing about this, is that you can taste it before you blend them up to see if they're to your taste. And if you want a little more garlic or a little more salt, you can add it in. So I'm going to stop the camera, and I'm going to cook these for about another half hour, and I'll come back at that time. Okay, I ended up letting it cook for about 2.5 hours, and you can see that there's liquid on it, not a ton of liquid, but a decent amount, so I think that that'll work out well. I do have a pitcher of water in case I need to add more, but I don't suspect that I'll need to do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an immersion blender, also called a stick blender, to blend this up. Now, one thing I want to address is that typically with refried beans, they're called refried beans because you do fry them. I am not going to do that because I don't want to have a lot of oil in them. And just in general, I typically don't do that, so they're healthier. You can see the consistency of them. The consistency doesn't matter too much because you're going to dehydrate off all the water. But I like to get them about this thick so that I can spread them well, but they don't have a ton, they're not real soupy. I'm actually going to use some of these in a meal tomorrow, so I'm going to go ahead and spoon some out rather than dehydrating all of them. So tomorrow after church, we're going to be having tacos using the taco meat that I canned. And I'll leave a link for that video so you can check it out. So I put some aside for that, and the rest I'm going to dehydrate. Let me get my dehydrator trays and I'll bring you right back. Okay, so I have the fruit leather trays because obviously this is kind of a liquidy type of thing, and I'm just going to plop down the beans and spread them on the tray. And I'll get them all smoothed out after I get them spread on. I have 4 of these fruit leather trays, so that's what I'm going to use, is distribute them more or less equally on each of those trays. And obviously the thicker they are, the longer they'll take to dehydrate. So we'll do the best we can here with hopefully not having them too thick, but I suspect it'll take quite a while for these to dehydrate because of the density and also because they're on the fruit leather tray, so the air is not going to flow through as well as they would if we were, using the trays like that are open. Okay, and I'll get the final tray on there. Actually, let me see, look how I don't know if you can see, but this is kind of piled a little higher, so let me spread it out a little bit more. Okay. And hopefully I've managed to get about an equal amount on each tray. It's always kind of a little bit of a guessing game. If it appears that one tray has more, I'll put that tray on the top, just because on the dehydrator that I'm using, the heating element and where the hot air blows through is at the top. And so, but I actually think I probably got this pretty equal. So I may rotate the trays. They say you don't have to, but it seems like it helps. So yeah, I'm just going to leave them in the order that I did them and then rotate them, because it looks to me like I got a pretty even amount on each one. Okay. All right, let's put the dehydrator top on. I mean, you can see I'm using the Nesco dehydrator. And this is the only dehydrator that I've had, so I can't really compare it with other ones. But I've been happy with it. So I'm just going to plug it in. And I am not sure of the right temperature for the refried beans, because obviously it doesn't fit into any of these categories. You've got fruits and vegetables 135, nuts and seeds 105, herbs 95, jerky 160, meats 160, fish 160. And I'm going to go on the high end of this, near the high end, because while it's not a meat, it is a protein source. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it up to, actually I think I'll go ahead and start it at 160 all the way up. And then the reason for that is, before I put this away, I'll be able to crumble up the beans and make sure that they're dried all the way through. So I'm going to go ahead and do it at 160, and I'll check back in a few hours and show you what things look like at that time. Hello everyone, it's been about 3 hours since I started, so I want to take a look and see how things are doing. Okay, you can see how it's drying up, but it's still obviously very moist on the inside. So I'm just going to kind of go through and break up the pieces to kind of help it dry in the middle. This isn't absolutely necessary, but I think it'll just help it move along a little bit faster. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the trays. Yeah, see, you can definitely see the dryness, especially around the edges. But in the center, it is still very moist, which is okay. It's only been 3 hours, which is not bad. I actually didn't expect it to be this far along at this point. And I don't know if you can tell, but this lower tray is not nearly as dry as the top 2 trays. And so it's good to be rotating them a little bit. Okay. And actually, it's kind of interesting because this bottom one, I actually didn't spread it quite as thick as the others. So even though it was on the bottom, it's a little bit more dry than what was the 3rd tray. So what I think I'm going to do is just kind of reverse these two trays. Okay. All right. I'm going to get this going again, and we'll check it again in a few hours and see how it is. Hello everyone, it is now actually the next evening. Now what happened is I got tired, I went to bed. It was almost all the way dry, and probably another hour or so would have done it, but I needed to go to bed, so I left it running overnight. When I checked it this morning, everything was bone dry, so I just unplugged it and left it in the dehydrator because I had a lot going on today. And so I'm just now getting around to taking a look at it. Now, if you live in a really humid environment, you may not want to just leave food in the dehydrator that you've unplugged. I wouldn't do it for long term, but since I'm in the desert, I felt like I could go ahead and do that for today and then get everything into a container tonight. Okay, so I'm going to take off the lid, and I'm assuming you can hear how it's sounding. It's extremely dry. And I don't personally feel a need to powder this. So, for example, I'm not going to put it into a blender or a grinder or anything like that, because it's fine for this to have some texture. And so I'm just using my hands and just kind of crumbling it into the container that I have. And that way that breaks it up, but it's not this huge process. And, you know, obviously it's fine for refried beans to have a little bit of texture to them. And so that's how I'm doing it. If you wanted them super fine, you could grind them up, but in my opinion, it's not necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and just get all of these into this container. And by the way, I wanted to say that we ate some of the refried beans today that had not been dehydrated. I don't know if you remember earlier in the video, I showed that I spooned some into a container, and I did that because I knew that they would go well with the lunch that we had today, and that was tacos. And for the tacos, I used some of my home canned taco meat. Anyway, you'll see I have a little bit of the beans left on the tray, so I'm just going to bend it and get it into the container like that. Okay, so now one reason why I'm using my hands like this, obviously my hands are clean, but I could feel if by chance there was a little spot that had some moisture, I would feel it. Whereas if I was using gloves or a spoon or something like that, and there was some type of moisture, I would not know that was the case. Now, one thing I love about using dehydrated refried beans instead of canned is, well, first of all, it's really cheap to make your own refried beans, because especially pinto beans are inexpensive. But also, you can make exactly the amount of beans that you want. You know, when you open a can of refried beans, I mean, you know, you pretty much are stuck using the whole can before it goes bad, or you have to freeze it or something like that. With dehydrated, you can make exactly what you want. If you are a single person, or you have a small family, or maybe you're the only person in the family that wants the beans to go with the Mexican food, you can make exactly what you want. You can make a half a cup of beans, or a cup, or however many. So speaking of that, let's talk about how to rehydrate them. Now, rehydrating the refried beans is super, super easy. All you do is as you do with most dehydrated foods, you simply pour some boiling water onto the beans. Now, I have found that it takes between a half a cup of water to 1 cup of beans, all the way up to a cup of water for a cup of the dehydrated beans. And really, that's just a matter of preference. So if you go into a Mexican restaurant, a lot of times the beans that are on a plate are pretty thin, pretty soupy, but yet you wouldn't want beans that soupy in a burrito, as an example, because it would just be really, really messy. So you want to start off with just a half a cup of water to 1 cup of the dehydrated beans, or whatever amount you're using. Obviously, if you're using 2 cups of the dehydrated beans, you would add a cup of water. If you were doing a half a cup of beans, you would add a 1/4 of a cup of water, and so on. So start with that, and if it's too thick for your preference, then you would just go ahead and add maybe a tablespoon or so at a time. Obviously, if you're making a big amount of beans, you could add 1/4 of a cup at a time, or so on. So you want to just add a little bit at a time in order to get the right consistency. And the thing that I like about it is that since these are already cooked, you definitely don't have to soak them for a long time or anything, just long enough for the beans to rehydrate. And like I said, I found that they rehydrate actually really fast. And if you're using boiling water on them, your beans are basically hot right away, and you don't have to pop them in the microwave or anything like that. Okay, looks like I picked about the right size container for this, because it's getting full. And remember, I started off with 4 cups of beans, well, about 5 cups of beans, but I spooned some out. And so this was probably about 2 pounds of beans. Not sure of the exact size of this container, but it's a good size container. So this is, actually, I'm really pleased with how many I ended up with. I don't know, I'm not sure of the measurement of this, but that's the container that I have. You can see my hands here for an idea of the size. And that's what I ended up with the basically 2 pounds of the beans. So we did have these today for lunch, and they were very tasty, and I'm looking forward to just keeping these in my pantry. Normally I would put them in a mason jar, but since we are still having a mason jar shortage, at least I'm having a mason jar shortage, I'm using this Rubbermaid type container instead. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video on how to make and dehydrate refried beans. If you did, I would appreciate it if you would like this video, and also if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel so you can get more tips on canning, dehydrating, other ways to build a prepper pantry. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.